Hello and welcome to the Window talkSPORT's daily YouTube show, keeping you up to date with everything going on in the transfer window, the done deals, the rumours and everything in between. So let's get straight into it. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by talkSPORT's transfer expert, Ben Jacobs. Ben, let's start with Benjamin Sesko, please, because we woke up to reports this morning that perhaps a deal with Arsenal isn't quite as done as we thought it was. Reports last week suggested that he'd agreed personal terms, but we're hearing today that actually that's hit a bit of a stumbling block.
Yeah, I don't think the personal terms were ever agreed, although there were some suggestions of that. Arsenal don't feel those personal terms will be a problem if they get that far. But as ever, it's the same situation where Arsenal are thinking about July, likely because of the new financial year, and they don't feel that they're under any pressure regarding either Victor Gyökeres or Benjamin Sesko, because both of those targets are very much being advanced by Andrea Berta, and nobody else has placed a formal bid for either of them. And there won't be the urgency or a specific need to force either through in the month of June, unless another suitor happens to come along. And Arsenal's perspective is clear that whichever one of these two names they go for, assuming that Alexander Isak does not genuinely become available, they want to try and do the deal for in the region of 70 million euros. 70 million euros is the pact from a year ago for Victor Gyökeres, but there's some suggestions that Sporting want to up that number. And Benjamin Sesko has had this variable release clause based on his individual performances. The better he does, the higher the number goes. And right now, because of last season, it's at 80 million euros. And again, Arsenal want to do that deal if they proceed more like 70. So this has never been about agreeing personal terms with Sesko, because Arsenal know what he's looking for. And if they go down that line, they believe they'll be able to agree terms because the player's keen on a move as he was 12 months ago. And it's the same with Gyökeres, who would welcome a bid from Arsenal. But first they have to understand whether or not Sporting are going to raise that price a little bit higher. So Andrea Berta is simultaneously advancing both of these deals, which is generally his style, because then he has a little bit of leverage on price with each club. And then from there, in the next kind of week or two, he'll make a final determination. And it remains likely that Arsenal will bid for one of Sesko or Gyökeres, but it's unlikely that both of them will arrive at the club.
Okay, so that's interesting. So the reports this morning suggested it was the personal terms that hadn't been agreed between Arsenal and Sesko. But you're saying, actually, that's not probably the problem. It's actually the deal between Arsenal and Leipzig.
Yeah, I think Benjamin Sesko is keen on Arsenal. 12 months ago, he had two considerations. One was he going to stay at Leipzig for another season? And that ended up being his decision. The second was which of the pitches was the strongest and which terms were acceptable. And 12 months ago, there was Arsenal, Chelsea and Manchester United. And Sesko basically picked the Arsenal project, but then decided he was going to put it on ice and wait a year. Then when Arsenal returned in January because they had need for a striker, Sesko and Leipzig again said no, nothing was possible mid-season. And now Arsenal are determining if they revisit that deal, because remember at that point it was work done by Edu and later Jason Ato. Now it's Andrea Berta who's brought Victor Gyökeres to the table. And his style, like I said before, is not to meticulously work on one target and just bank on getting that player. It's actually to leverage two targets or more against each other. Because right now, Sporting may be saying it's not the 100 million release clause for Gyökeres, but we want 80. And Leipzig may be saying Benjamin Sesko has a release clause, we want that 80 million, simply because there's so much time left in the window that the selling club has a lot of advantage. Whereas Berta's perspective is you can drive the Sesko price down if they want to go in that direction. And if player buy-in is there, the Gyökeres situation may eventually result in this pact being honoured, which means the player can also leave for 70 million euros. But it's not really been an Arsenal thing going to Sesko and pre-agreed terms, because first they have to decide if they're going to go for Sesko or Gyökeres, and that determination is most likely to be based upon which price Arsenal actually think is value for money. And that's the part with both clubs that is currently being worked on and explored.
So when you say that they're looking at both players and sort of working on both deals and seeing what works, do you feel like Sesko is the main priority and Gyökeres is perhaps a backup option, or are they just keeping their options open at this stage and they haven't put a number one as a target?
I think the feeling heading into the window was that Benjamin Sesko would be the priority, but obviously Andrea Berta has changed that somewhat, and now it is fair to say, as frustrating as it may be to Arsenal fans, that both deals are simply being explored, and day on day we get asked for updates. But again, I don't think Arsenal feel they need to force this one through one way or the other right now. It may be a transfer, even though number 9 is a key priority, that they're happy to put on the next financial year, which is why we've had to wait a little bit for clarity, which is expected to come soon. But I think Arsenal were always thinking of their number 9 as kind of a July the 1st deal or onwards, and that's more preferable to put this kind of outlay into the next financial year. In addition to that, Arsenal are not in the Club World Cup. They don't have that same urgency to move as maybe Chelsea or Manchester City. Liverpool is a different scenario because they've been planning for quite some time. Richard Hughes has been in for longer, and I think they knew the kind of players that they thought they could move decisively on. And people will say, why can Liverpool spend this kind of money and Arsenal haven't yet? And there's probably two answers. The first is that at the end of the window, let's actually see whether Arsenal's spend is that far off Liverpool's total spend, because if you add Zubimendi, a number 9, a left winger, a left back, a backup goalkeeper, Arsenal actually should have a big outlay as well. They just may want to, like I said before, put it on the books for the next financial year. So that's kind of one factor in why Liverpool, who are in a stronger PSR position, have moved decisively, and perhaps Arsenal are waiting out of caution, even though their PSR position is by no means as precarious as Manchester United or Aston Villa. And then the second aspect is just that Liverpool had to move on some of these deals, or could move on some of these deals. So the could part is, if the player's got a release clause like Jeremy Frimpong and you simply think that's value for money, then there's no point in waiting. And the need to move for Liverpool was based on the fact that with Florian Wirtz, the player set that time scale. He wanted to make a fast decision, and Liverpool faced periodic competition from Manchester City and Bayern Munich. So due to the volume of suitors there, that was always likely to resolve itself. Once again, Arsenal do not yet have another rival formal bidder for Benjamin Sesko, even though other clubs are interested. And the same for Victor Gyökeres. Manchester United like the player, but they've also not made a formal bid to Sporting, and I don't think United will do their number 9 until the next financial year either. So this is why Arsenal are calm about the situation, and Andrea Berta in the next few weeks now will have to decide in what direction he wants to go, and that's why I don't think we'll have to wait too much longer now before we get clarity and Arsenal do make a formal bid.
You mentioned Manchester United there. We know they're in for a striker. A player who's been mentioned and linked with the club today is the former Everton striker Moise Kean, who's now at Fiorentina. What do you know about that?
Yeah, there's a possibility that we see movement here because the player's got a 52 million euros release clause, which is only valid in the first 2 weeks or so of July. So if anybody is going to trigger that clause, then we will not have to wait too long to find out. If Fiorentina want to keep the player, I think it's going to be a situation of clause or nothing, either triggering it or matching it. And there's a very realistic possibility that he just stays in Fiorentina. I'd keep an eye on Saudi Arabia as well when this clause becomes active, because I'm told that Al Qadsiya in particular are very interested. As far as Manchester United are concerned, I'm not aware of any approach or anything advanced. It would be normal for clubs to be aware of the clause. I think Manchester United's perspective at the moment is to try and get Brian Mbeumo over the line. That's what they're actively working on. From Brentford's perspective, they want a fee in excess of 60 million. And Manchester United is still in verbal talks. And people ask me constantly, why no second bid? And Manchester United trying to use these talks to get themselves in a position where they feel when they place the second bid, they've got the highest possible chance of success. Regarding the number 9, the key priority was Liam Delap, but he went to Chelsea. So now Manchester United have had to revisit, and they're drawing up a list of new targets and running data on several players. And we've heard reports in the last few weeks of Kean, of Dusan Vlahovic. But these are names I'm only aware of Manchester United factoring into their due diligence and running data on. At this stage, I don't think they've finalised that new short list, and there's certainly been no outreach to either the player side or Fiorentina yet. But because of the clause of Kean, that is quite an interesting one to watch for all clubs, simply because it will expire in the middle of July. And I think Fiorentina's perspective is that if they don't get an appropriate offer or that clause triggered in that window, then they want to shut the door and keep the player, because their firm preference is for him to stay. And I think Kean has been very happy at Fiorentina as well. So once again, it's not a given that he moves. Also on Manchester United's list of those considered, you've got Victor Gyökeres, who, just because he's leaning perhaps towards Arsenal or would welcome a bid, that's not the same as the player rejecting Manchester United. So if Arsenal, for example, did move in the Sesko direction, then Victor Gyökeres would still like to move to the Premier League, and Manchester United could become a possibility. But we're not at the stage yet where Manchester United are negotiating for Victor Gyökeres, and that's why we may have to be patient, especially because also Manchester United have got a tight PSR position. So that's going to be the kind of transfer that bleeds into July or even beyond into the August type of time frame. You have Alexander Mitrovic, a very interesting and more short-term option. And Manchester United's perspective there is not that they want to go and sign Mitrovic over other names, but perhaps with the possibility that Rasmus Højlund goes to Italy, they might be able to bring in a player like Mitrovic on a short-term deal with Al Hilal paying some of the wages. And the thing to watch after the Club World Cup, because Mitrovic has travelled and is playing with Al Hilal, is whether or not they finally get this flagship number 9. Because I can tell you, Al Hilal have not given up on Victor Osimhen, even though he rejected them 4 times before the Club World Cup, even though Galatasaray retain a really strong interest, even though there is European clubs thinking maybe Osimhen isn't going to go to Saudi. But Al Hilal are still thinking after the Club World Cup, the same for Theo Hernandez, and they're confident about the latter. There might be a possibility of Osimhen joining later in the window. And if Hilal sign Osimhen or any other big-name striker, they've tried in the past as well for Darwin Nunez, then it's very likely, because of the quotas in Saudi Arabia, that Mitrovic is a player that departs. He's on a high wage, and Manchester United are just alert to that. Is there a possibility, perhaps even in addition to a new permanent number 9, that a player like Mitrovic could arrive, do a loan, have some wage coverage from Al Hilal? It might just suit all parties. So that could be another name to watch. Mateta keeps being mentioned for Manchester United too. I've made new inquiries on this one. Situation is the same. Manchester United appreciate the player. They've not made any kind of approach to Crystal Palace yet. Palace want to keep him. They're going to have likely Europa League football unless we get any surprises with UEFA. John Textor looks like he's going to sell his stake to Woody Johnson, and that should resolve the situation. So with European football, I would expect Mateta to stay at Crystal Palace, barring an astronomical offer. So we have to be patient with this Manchester United search for a new number 9, because number 1, they're focused on Mbeumo. 2, they're going to have outgoings and resolve the future, potentially of Rasmus Højlund and certainly of Marcus Rashford, and likely bring in a fee for Alejandro Garnacho and possibly even resolve the Antony situation. Then they'll determine how much budget they've got, and at that point the targets will be a whole lot clearer.
Well, you mentioned Saudi Arabia there. Nicolas Jackson is someone who's been linked with a move to Saudi. Obviously, Chelsea fans slightly frustrated with him. 2 red cards in only a few games, one at the end of the Premier League season, and then again against Flamengo in the Club World Cup. With Delap coming into Chelsea now, do you think that Chelsea could perhaps let Jackson go, and would Saudi be a potential place where he might end up?
I don't think Nicolas Jackson will go to Saudi. When you have a peak player who has a high ceiling, it's always normal that a developing league like Saudi Arabia may show an interest, but that doesn't mean that the player will bite. It was kind of groundbreaking in many ways when John Duran went to Al Nassr, and that's led deal makers to believe that they can replicate that with other kind of profiles. But I think that Nicolas Jackson for now is focused on Chelsea, and was he to somehow leave, then you're likely looking at a departure to Europe rather than Saudi Arabia. But at this stage, it's really important to stress that Chelsea are not going to sell Nicolas Jackson barring a crazy offer. And there's no real talk within Chelsea about that possible exit yet. What we know is that Chelsea are likely to add another forward. And if you look at the kind of profiles they are exploring, such as Mohamed Kudus, João Pedro, their appreciation for Morgan Rogers, these are not number 9s in the Jackson or Delap mode. They're essentially replacements for Christopher Nkunku, who is expected to depart. So if Chelsea go into the Premier League season with Liam Delap and Nicolas Jackson, they will be satisfied. There's big faith in Jackson, and he's certainly not being forced out of the club. If somebody comes along and places a crazy offer, then will Chelsea give that due consideration? Possibly. But this is not a case of Jackson is suspended again and now his future at the club is in doubt. Enzo Maresca really likes the player. And one of the clues that shows that is in this search for a new forward, however versatile you may classify them, Chelsea have ruled out now Benjamin Sesko. And the reason for that is because they think he's too similar a profile to Nicolas Jackson and also Liam Delap. So Jackson's got the number 9 and the pressure of that. He's going to get the games now at the Club World Cup because it's at least a 1-game suspension for Jackson. He's going to start, in likelihood, if fit, the opening Premier League game of the season because Jackson's suspended. So there is going to be a lot of talk, a lot of noise, perhaps even a bit of smoke as well about Jackson's future. And you can understand why suitors in ambitious places like Saudi Arabia and also within Europe are at least wondering whether Chelsea might be persuaded to sell. But at this stage, all I can tell you is that Chelsea value Nicolas Jackson, and unless they get crazy money, he's likely to simply stay at the club.
So sticking with Chelsea then, someone else who was on Chelsea's radar is the Borussia Dortmund winger Jamie Gittens. There was news today that Bayern Munich are also interested in him. What's the latest on that? Because Chelsea had the original £42 million offer rejected by Dortmund, didn't they? Do you think Bayern Munich could potentially hijack this offer?
Well, Bayern are looking for that left-sided player. Their dream is Nico Williams, and it's financially feasible for them, and it isn't for Barcelona, but the player wants Barcelona. He's also got a renewal option with Athletic Bilbao too. So it'll be interesting to see if we get a twist in the Nico Williams saga. Right now, it's really all about Barcelona and can they find a way to pull this deal off financially? And Williams is prepared to wait a little bit. But Bayern are there trying to get the player to turn his head with a bigger salary and trying to persuade the player that he might face a long wait if he wants Barcelona. And it reminds me actually of a situation with Rafinha, where Chelsea agreed a deal first with Leeds United, and everyone said Barcelona wouldn't be able to match that deal or pull it off. But Rafinha said, I only want Barcelona. He waited, and eventually Barcelona were able to get that deal done. And Rafinha has been outstanding in the past season. With Nico Williams, I sense at the moment it's the same, that he'll give complete preference to Barcelona to try and get this one over the line. But Bayern are being really aggressive with Williams first. With Jamie Gittens, they definitely appreciate him, so he could be an option. But I think this might be another scenario where Bayern lose out trying to get a player who they think might move from one German club to another, a bit like Florian Wirtz. And in the end, that player might go, like Wirtz did, to the Premier League. Because Gittens has already agreed terms with Chelsea. He wanted to move in time for the Club World Cup, but Chelsea were just not prepared to pay a so-called tax in order to get that over the line before the 10th of June deadline. So now they're taking their time. The clubs are still speaking, and Chelsea are expected to place another bid, because at this stage, Gittens has become the leading candidate for Chelsea on that left-hand side. On the 10th of June, we heard some reports that Chelsea placed a third bid. So the first one was rejected at 30 million. The second one was rejected at 42 million. But we did hear some suggestions that a third bid was placed. That's not my understanding. The last bid Chelsea placed was 42 million. And if they get up to about 45 million, but with a preferable structure, so a high percentage of that as a guaranteed fee, reachable add-ons, or preferable payment terms that suit Dortmund, then that 45 number is likely to stand a very strong chance of success. So Chelsea are not too far off the valuation, and I still think we can call Chelsea the front runners for Jamie Gittens, even though that Bayern interest is genuine.
Excellent. We'll keep an eye on that. Thanks a lot, Ben.
Thanks, always a pleasure.